Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 42nd installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Webinar Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Dwayne Mancini. I'm the CEO at Project MedTech. Today, we'll be hearing from Chris Rush at Greenlight Guru. We'll be hearing about challenges of clinical data collection in MedTech and why it's worth it. Key takeaways from this will be why collecting data for Class 2 and Class 3 devices is valuable, timeline, cost, and challenges for running clinical studies, and how to efficiently plan and delegate activities for data collection, including CRO and EDC software selection. And when we talk about CRO, we're talking about clinical research organization, and EDC is electronic data capture. But first, a few housekeeping slides of information on Galen Data. Galen Data is an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. The company is ISO 13485 certified, and the product on AWS is high trust certified as well. Founded by seasoned medical device professionals, the company's goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of the cost while shaving months off the development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. And if you could do us a favor and go follow Galen Data on LinkedIn, that would be much appreciated. Some quick logistics on the webinar today. On your control panel, if you have any questions, feel free to drop those in there. You can do it in the question section, which is right below webcam and right above polls. I will be monitoring that throughout Chris's presentation and some of the Q&As some of the questions we already received, and ask those of Chris as we go. Should we not get to your question, we will follow up separately after the webinar and get to those. There are also 5 handouts just below the polls section there. You'll see 3 from Galen Data, including a Galen Data white paper, Galen Data data sheet, and then also a EHR Galen Connect product sheet as well. From Greenlight Guru, you'll see a product suite overview and also a clinical digital overview. Both Galen and Greenlight contact info will be on the final slide. So if you need to get that down and want to follow up with Chris or the Galen team, feel free to do so. And as a reminder, you will receive a recording of this webinar via email, and feel free to follow up with us should you have any additional questions. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Chris Rush. Chris is a biomedical engineer and has been in the medical device space for about 13 years. He spent a number of years managing clinical studies for Class 3 devices and pivotal studies, PMA studies, and post-market registries. He is currently working as a solutions engineer at Greenlight Guru, where he showcases the value of their clinical data capture software to prospects. Chris, the virtual floor is all yours.
Excellent, Dwayne. Thank you very much. Yeah, pleasure to be here, and really appreciate the chance to present to everybody that's joining here today. The topic here is going to be challenges of clinical data collection in MedTech, and ultimately why it's worth it. As Dwayne alluded to, I'll also be touching on some best practices for selecting CRO partners, software tools like electronic data capture tools as well. So jumping right into it, let's start with for Class 1 and Class 2, 3 devices here. There are obviously vast differences. There are many reasons why clinical data collection is valuable to an organization. Today, I want to focus on the regulatory requirements at a very high level in the US and in the EU, as well as touching on the business case of why is this really ultimately important beyond just the regulations. And then we'll get into challenges with collecting clinical data, how to plan for overcoming those challenges, utilizing partners and software technology as well. Just as a side note, for Class 1, will be largely sidelines for today. Class 1, by and large, is exempt from clinical data collection. So let's hop right into the regulations. There's really no way around this piece. This is the part that everyone has to do. As a disclaimer, I'm not a regulatory consultant by any means, and this review probably will not be entirely comprehensive, but it is important to touch on what is required. Again, Class 1 largely exempt from requirements due to the low risk associated with that class of devices. So we see there's 3 main pathways to market in the US. So we see 510K for class 2, typically pre-market approval or PMA for class 3, typically. Historically, the overall time to approval in the US market has been slower than in Europe. When I was working at a CRO, we saw the same devices being studied in Europe and in the US, and typically those class 3 devices, primarily that I was working with, became available first in Europe. This paradigm may be shifting in recent years with the advent of the EU MDR coming into effect, and a little bit more on that on the next slide. But firstly, here for 510K clearance, the path to approval for class 2 devices is via what's called pre-market notification, more commonly known as 510K. Most 510K devices rely on non-clinical testing to demonstrate equivalency, including conformance standards that are recognized by the FDA. The testing required for these class 2 devices really depends on the specific risk and generic type of the device. According to the consulting firm Emergo, the FDA typically is requiring clinical data for approximately 10 to 15% of 510Ks. And to really examine that 510K pathway for your device, we recommend taking the FDA product code, examining any available guidance documents, consensus standards, as well as recent 510Ks that can indicate if clinical data is necessary for your device. With that being said, class 2 devices most often do not require clinical data for clearance to the US market. For that reason, pursuing this pathway is very attractive to device manufacturers because it's avoiding clinical data rigor that's required for class 3 devices, which follow. PMA, pre-market approval for class 3 devices. So clinical data is basically always required for class 3 devices pursuing pre-market approval to the US market. Pre-market approval by FDA it's a required process. It's a scientific review to ensure safety, effectiveness of class 3 devices. And again, it's almost always requiring clinical data for approval through the PMA. The regulatory admin costs associated with these pathways I've listed here, and it's pretty clear here that regulators are going to spend a lot more resources to assess class 3 devices. On that note, beyond the admin fees that I've listed here, the actual cost of device clinical studies to a sponsor can be great. They can average, if you do a Google search, somewhere on a $5 to $10 million US dollar range, and these can take years to complete these types of studies. So with that said, the burden to regulatory approval through PMA is great. We also have humanitarian device exemption. So there are other pathways such as HDE, breakthrough expedited access. However, these are less frequently used today and really beyond the scope of what I'm presenting here in terms of regulations. And the question I'd really like to examine subsequently in a few moments here is why gather clinical data if it's not required for instance, a class 2 device? Why might we do that even if it's not black and white letter of the law required by the regulation? First, let's take a look at the landscape in Europe. Again, very high level here. So in Europe, the medical device regulation is the regulation that's applicable to all member states of the European Union. Of note here, there is no centralized competent authority for medical devices in the EU. And for that reason, the notified body system has been implemented in Europe. Notified bodies essentially act on behalf of the European Commission to approve medical devices, and a notified body is supervised by the designated competent authority of the member state or the country where they're located. Of note there, if you receive notified body approval from a German notified body, for instance, like TÜV SÜD for your product, you can market that product throughout the EU. In other words, approval at one notified body is accepted by all the member states. And there is some variability in terms of the perceived challenge of receiving CE mark amongst the notified bodies in Europe. So there is some variation in terms of interacting with the different notified bodies. In Europe, conformity assessment is required for class 2A up through class 3 prior to CE marking. And CE marking ultimately allows for the device to be marketed in Europe. And contrary to the regulatory pathways in the US, in Europe, the requirements for clinical data are the same for Class 2B implantable and Class 3 devices in the EU. So you might notice while the pathways to market are not as clearly differentiated based on device class like in the US, where it's Class 2, typically it's 510K, Class 3, typically going to be PMA. In Europe, the extent to which clinical data is required for CE marking, it does still generally increase as the risk of the device goes up. So less data required for lower risk Class 2 devices, a lot more clinical data for Class 3 devices. I don't have the cost breakdown here in terms of the administrative fees like I did for the US pathways. You can probably find that online pretty quickly. But again, the regulatory admin costs usually are a drop in the bucket, or they can be compared to the cost of data collection, which can be in the millions of euros in this case. So again, is this all worth it? Lastly, I want to touch briefly on post-market regulation. Keep this really brief, but the rigor has increased greatly under the EU MDR compared to the Medical Device Directive, the MDD that the MDR is replacing. And then in the post-market in the US, clinical data collection post-market may be required for Class 2 or greater here in the US as well. So let's get back to that question. Is all of this really worth it? So I want to take a look at the business case of data collection. And I've got an interesting bit of information here. So from a business perspective, the return on investment for Class 2 and Class 3 devices was analyzed here in this table from a 2019 Silicon Valley Bank healthcare market report. And this is about 5 years old now, but not a lot has changed from a regulatory standpoint here in the US, where there is a continued perceived incentive to pursue 510K clearance if at all possible. But some of the insights I'll share here from this slide would probably apply to the European market as well in terms of Class 2 versus Class 3 and the rigor of clinical data collection required. So we know that 510K devices typically have a quicker regulatory path to market. But here at the far right of this table, we're seeing time to exit, medium time to exit for these technologies. PMA devices are actually faster to exit, according to this report, than 510K, 6.7 years versus almost 9 for 510K, which really seems counterintuitive. But considering the clinical data aspect, while PMA devices, these Class 3 devices, do face a higher regulatory burden initially, and they do require extensive clinical studies before entering the market. Once these devices reach the market, in that market, the clinical community is a very data-driven community. Clinicians are typically making decisions based on data. Once those technologies reach the market, the physician end users and the hospital systems that are overseeing large-scale purchasing of all the technology coming in, they're typically making those purchasing decisions based on data, which for these Class 3 devices is already available upon entry to the market. 510K devices, on the other hand, while initially it's perceived they have and it's true, they have a lower regulatory hurdle to market in terms of clinical data. Once reaching the market, these 510K devices often face the challenge of market uptake with less clinical data, or even no clinical data of its own specific to that device to actually drive market uptake. To achieve market uptake, it does require work. It requires resources, loads of resources from sales, marketing, and oftentimes in the post-market, data collection is utilized at the end of the day for peer-reviewed journals, that sort of thing to drive market uptake of the device. So really to put a fine point here from a business perspective, avoiding clinical data collection on the front end, if it's not required for market entry, is often just delaying the inevitable need to provide evidence of that device to the end users in the form of clinical data later on to drive that market uptake. And recognizing that this is single factor, the relative rigor of clinical data required for Class 3 versus Class 2 devices can help explain this seemingly illogical contradiction here of the M&A activity that we see in this report here for class 2 versus class 3. Just a side note, I think it would be interesting to see an analysis within class 2 devices examining specifically the amount of published data versus time to exit within that class 2 category. But it seems clear here that companies with highly studied devices seem to reach the exit, reach that M&A activity faster. We also have some data that we've recently collected through the Greenlight Guru State of the MedTech Industry Benchmark Report. We do this every year since 2019, and it includes hundreds of MedTech professionals and leaders sharing their voice on the state of the industry. And this year we had over 500 industry voices. So I want to share some of that information here as well as to priorities and trends within respondents from that survey. So firstly, we asked things like, what are your top business objectives? Really unsurprisingly, market approval for a new product is right at the top there. Interestingly, 27% say clinical investigations, trials, or evaluations, and then 21% post-market clinical activities. And the survey respondents here, these represent really every device class known to regulators, so probably mostly class 2, class 3 down in this at the bottom 2 bars here. But we can see that clinical activities are a huge priority for manufacturers, probably very similar to many of the attendees here today. Secondly, we found that the plurality of respondents here responding yes are planning new clinical activities, and teams that we talk to day in, day out, conversations that I'm having every week, we're hearing teams telling us that clinical teams are really expected to do more with less. Financial pressures are a reality, and clinical teams are typically facing tight budgets and funding challenges. So clinical teams really are tasked with doing more with less people on the clinical teams, as well as more with less funding of the clinical projects. So those budgets are tight. They're an ever-present challenge. So really finding efficiencies for running clinical studies is of paramount importance for probably most of the respondents here in that yes category. And then lastly, we asked about the conduct of clinical studies, how teams are doing this. And here's what we find. So 23% fully in-house, 22% outsourcing to a CRO or consultants, and then vast plurality here, combination of in-house and consultants. So sponsors really are not doing this alone. It's very common. We'll see a little bit later. If you look online, I think it's 3 out of 4 studies typically use CROs. That probably includes pharma studies as well. So our data might be a little bit different from the MedTech perspective. But these CROs, these consultants really are invaluable partners to really getting it right when it comes to the massive investment of a clinical study. In terms of high-level timelines, this is looking at the entire life cycle of a product, but the overall timelines really depend specific to the studies, the clinical activities. They depend greatly on the scope of the study and the length of the follow-up of the studies. Some studies lasting just a matter of months, and other times they can last upwards of 5 years with long-term follow-up. And I saw a lot of that in the class 3 world. With all of the stages seen here within the overall product timeline, really, if there's poor management of the timeline associated with clinical studies in terms of the preparation as well as the execution of the studies, that can really equate to excruciating delays and tons of unnecessary cost to the sponsor. But if it's properly managed, if it's well managed efficiently, it can really be a boon to the body of evidence surrounding the device, and also not delay the overall life cycle of the product. So I do want to talk about how to best partner with CROs as well as software tools to bring efficiencies to this critical activity here. So let's hop into, firstly, CROs. Dwayne mentioned it a little bit earlier. A CRO, I worked for one, it stands for Contract Research Organization. And a CRO is essentially, it's an organization contracted by typically the sponsor, the manufacturer, to take the lead in managing the company's trials and the testing responsibilities. that may include even preclinical. Sometimes animal benchtop testing, CROs can do that as well. And here we see nearly 3 out of 4 clinical studies are conducted by a CRO on behalf of the medical device company. So very likely, if any of these previous stats describe your team, that you'll probably be interfacing with a CRO. In terms of the services provided by CROs, they really can range widely. There's small CROs, large CROs, pharma-specific, device-specific, some that cover both. But their services really cover the full suite of functionalities associated with testing of the device, including preclinical, feasibility studies. They can help with patient recruitment, the overall study project management, writing regulatory dossiers and ethics submissions. This is probably more for pharma, phase 1, 2, 3, 4. Site selection, CROs have oftentimes have a good handle on good sites that could be utilized for a particular study. They'll also do the data monitoring. So if there's any source data verification, some of the data management activities, they'll handle that as well if needed. Pharmacovigilance, stat analysis, medical writing. So as you can see, they really can cover the entire gamut of every activity essentially associated with a clinical study. As you're starting to begin considering working with a CRO, I want to share some best practices for how to best engage, how to prepare for working with CROs. So here, how to select and work with a clinical operations partner. As you're defining your requirements, we suggest taking some of the best practices we've learned here at Greenlight Guru. We partner with other software companies. We also partner extensively with CROs. And we really recommend using the SMART approach, laying out your study goals, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bounds, which can really just help write better requirements when reaching out to the clinical partners that you're considering. Secondly here, assessing internal capabilities. So taking a hard look at some teams internally have a dedicated clinical team, maybe even just one person. Some teams are planning to make additional hires in preparation for a clinical study. So really mapping out what are those core competencies going to be for those additional hires, and really understanding what can we do in-house versus what do we need a clinical partner, a CRO, to take on for us. And then lastly, steps 3 and 4 here, as the study is progressing, testing and validating each of those components of the study and mapping those back to your requirements, really allowing you to continually assess the internal as well as the partner deliverables so that there's really continuous learning for the current study as well as any future studies and any future partnerships with that CRO. So as I mentioned, at Greenlight Guru Clinical, we do work with a lot of CROs. So we've put together this cheat sheet that we recommend using when working with a CRO, and kind of considerations that you might take when you're speaking with them. So here's a listing. We'll go through each of these briefly here, starting with individual preferences. This one's the most subjective probably. So even at your first interaction with a CRO, you're typically going to be working with an individual or a couple individuals. That's usually the ongoing relationship. You have a point of contact. So we're really doing business with people. So these individual preferences, while they're subjective, they really can't be undervalued. Seeking recommendations from peers, from your professional network, previous relationships at previous companies that you've worked for. Just keeping an eye on punctuality, professionalism during your initial interactions with the CRO. Those will probably translate down the road to their interactions with your clinicians and certainly with you as a sponsor as the study gets up and running. And then of course, language capabilities, objectively, they need to be able to perform their duties in the languages in which the study will be executed. So won't harp too long on this here, but culture fit, really it's apparent early on, and it's a gut feeling that really can't be ignored. You can pretty quickly get a sense, is the team that you're talking to, are they high attention to detail? Are they more scrappy, fast and loose? Does that fit in with your company culture? Is that what you need from a CRO? And simply how transparent do they seem during your initial engagement, that sort of thing. And then a little bit more objectively, getting into site access. So obviously the sites that you'll be selecting are going to be hugely impactful on the enrollments and the quality of the data. CROs typically have relationships with sites or experience assessing sites. So considering, are there specific sites that you're targeting that the CRO has a relationship with that are of strategic importance to your study. Those sites might have key opinion leaders or KOLs. Those sites often will have experience with competitive devices, similar device classes, and then really just understanding, does the clinical workflow facilitate a good partnership when it comes to executing the study that you're designing? And then, of course, lastly, is the site in a country, in a region where you plan to commercialize? Just a quick note here on KOLs. So key opinion leaders, they oftentimes are part of a larger sales and marketing strategy. Certain investigators at certain sites can offer clinical prestige. They can have outsized impact on the clinical community. These are really key players to have within your study. I found working at a CRO, oftentimes there's a mix of high enrolling sites, lower enrolling sites. Sometimes these key opinion leaders are great podium speakers. They're great for having an impact, having influence on the clinical community. They may not be your highest enrollers. So really considering having a mix of sites with those KOLs, as well as some more workhorse silent partners. They're not as podium active, but they're really driving a lot of the enrollments. And they may not even want to be on a podium. So just understanding where that mix will be, and oftentimes CROs can help navigate those considerations as well. Does the CRO have experience in your clinical realm? This is really important as well. If they do, they can often have a really important impact on the actionable inputs for study designs, case report form designs, understanding the clinical workflow. Experience with your clinical niche, if you will, really is even more important if it is a specialized device category, treating rare diseases, for instance. So when considering all these things, really seeking some sort of kind of validation or proof of this as well. So we always recommend, it's certainly not unusual to ask for specific references for other companies that are maybe in your device class or in your specialty disease area where the device is actually treating. So seeking those out, really important as well. And they're usually pretty open to providing those if they're available. The cost and structure of those costs for working with a CRO, also really important to consider. When you're talking to a CRO, the cost on that initial quote is almost never what it ends up being in reality. So really understanding what's driving the cost, what is the structure of those costs, and what happens if, what are the risks for exceeding costs? Are they billing by patient, by hour? Are there certain performance metrics that are driving costs within the CRO? So really understanding all of the what ifs associated with working with the CRO can really be a good way of avoiding a budget explosion here. And really sharing what's important with the vendor can really influence how they structure their fees. We always recommend understanding maybe what is the maximum total price of this engagement, and then backing into best case scenarios, potential cost savings. Oftentimes we'll give you a more realistic idea of what the cost for working with the CRO will be, rather than just looking at that initial quote and assuming that's 100% accurate. So access to data. Typically CROs are utilizing some sort of software tool to actually gather the clinical data. And what does access to that data look like? Some electronic data capture systems are somewhat closed to the sponsor. So sometimes the sponsor would have to go through, or oftentimes you'll have to go through a data manager to actually scope what you need from the data. And then the data manager would then go and extract data reports or data exports, generate reports, et cetera. And really, as the importance of data to every organization really is becoming more and more important, especially with the advent of AI, using that data for future marketing purposes, understanding this piece in terms of data access will be really key. Some CROs will prescribe or suggest EDC systems. Some will allow you to pick which one you want and propose that to them. So there's a couple of ways to do that, but really understanding this access to the data is important. In terms of generating reports, also, how frequently are those? How direct is the control of you as the sponsor in terms of generating reports, building reports. Some systems are very rigid and require a lot of manipulation from a data manager to actually work within the tool. Others are a little bit more user-friendly. In this realm here, access to data, this is really where we here at Greenlight Guru can help most directly with all the aspects I'm talking through in this presentation. We can help sponsors have direct, intimate access to the data. We can also enable sponsors to reuse studies. So copying and pasting, for instance, a pre-market study for subsequent post-market studies, where we may be capturing similar data in the post-market, recycling CRFs, all that sort of thing. And then in terms of patient engagement, so CROs, there's a vast variety of CROs working with different medical specialties, that sort of thing. So understanding the CRO's understanding of patient engagement really will be key to successful recruitment, but also quality of the data. And then especially if you have any patient-reported outcome types of measures in your study, these can be a little tricky. And understanding, does the CRO partner have a documented track record of collecting and successfully gathering high-quality patient-reported outcome measures? Just at a high level, for a CRO, you really want to understand, does the partner understand the specific patient population? If your device is a very patient-centric device, that will be a very key component to the CRO understanding who these people are, what are their technology familiarities. Are they comfortable with smartphones and email, or are they an older population where it'll be a little more challenging? If your device is more clinician-centric, then that'll come down more to the clinical workflow, more so than an understanding of the patients, but really understanding and laying out that dynamic for the CRO and understanding, gaining an understanding of what their approach has been to those types of studies. And then lastly, from a practical standpoint, scoping out the timeline of working with the CRO will help minimize delays in engaging with them, and also planning for the timelines associated with all of their activities related to the projects. First thing that comes to mind, site selection, site training, what does the timeline look like for that? Really making sure that aligns with when you're wanting to go live with the study. What is the estimated time to set up the study? This includes, signing with the CRO, but also setting up the data capture system. Clinical studies really chronically delayed, so seeking how they typically approach study delays and how they can mitigate risks to those study delays. Oftentimes, enrollment is a big blocker to your study timelines. So digging into their site selection, what are their SOPs, what are their processes for assessing sites, understanding site bandwidth, that sort of thing, and which ties back into the access to the sites. And then really importantly, what kind of capacity does the CRO have to deliver on your study? Oftentimes, most often, CROs are working with a number of different sponsors, and there can be simply competing priorities. Are you expecting a dedicated resource? Are you expecting a flexible resource at the CRO to interface with you as the sponsor? And what does that engagement look like? And again, how can you test or document this? Kick the tires a little bit, seek an understanding of how they resolve issues, as well as seek any references that you can, again, kick the tires a little bit. So the overall process of choosing a CRO, it can take quite a bit of time. So it's good practice to begin this assessment probably 6 months to a year before studies start. Following these steps, firstly, identifying the scope of the services you need, and then researching CROs, tapping your network, getting a short list, submitting RFPs to the identified CROs, and then meeting with the sales team at the CRO or the business development person at the CRO to refine that and discuss the project, and then bid defense signature at the end there. So typically 6 months to a year out is probably a good time. I mentioned a little bit earlier, we do partner, Greenlight Guru partners with a lot of CROs. We have an extensive partner network, and we've asked them, what does good engagement, what does best engagement look like? And I want to share that with the team here. It's pretty basic here, but It also depends on, if your team can provide all of the information in the best case scenario. May not be the case, that's okay. But where do we start with good engagement? So having a proposed timeline of the study, description of the device, indications. You may not have a protocol yet, that's okay. Better is going to look like a more refined description of the study. You might even have a draft protocol, inclusion, exclusion. Maybe you have some case report forms drafted up. And then best case, and again, may not be achievable every time, but really having all the documentation for the proposed study, including the protocol, and then very clearly having scoped out what you as the sponsor plan to handle in-house versus what you'll need outsourced and taken on by the CRO directly. So just a brief note on our partner network. We do have a partner network that combines expert services of CROs with our EDC platform, Greenlight Guru Clinical, which is a purpose-built EDC tool for MedTech. You can learn more about this by visiting greenlight.guru/partners-CRO. You can navigate through the site and find that pretty quickly if you forget that URL. Just a couple of the CROs that we do work with. We work with large CROs, we work with smaller CROs. So this is just a high-level summary of some of the partners that we work with. Again, feel free to reach out to us here. We'd be happy to make introductions or share just contact information so you can begin to scope out different CROs that you may want to consider. Okay, so let's get into the aspect of software tools that can be utilized to drive efficiencies in your clinical activities as well. So this paper-based approach, I've worked on paper-based systems. If anyone on the call here has, I'm sure you would attest. Very administrative, overburdening from an administrative side. It's very manual. Most of half my time was spent on simply updating and tracking things manually. So if you're considering EDCs, that can be of great value to the efficiency of your clinical studies. So let's take a look at, in terms of steps that we recommend taking when working with an EDC. And this is kind of similar to the process of engaging with the CRO. We work with sponsor companies day in, day out that are assessing EDCs, and we've summarized, best engagement, what that looks like. Firstly, finding out your organization's internal purchasing process. So you can probably, your company probably has an internal process for large purchases like software, like an EDC system. In mid-size to large MedTech companies, you'll likely be able to find this process in the finance department, perhaps in a dedicated purchasing department that operates under finance's umbrellas. So really understanding what that purchase process looks like before reaching out to EDCs, because they'll typically ask what that process entails. And then documenting your organization's needs. So you here on the call probably have a clear understanding of why you need an EDC solution, but that oftentimes does not equate to company leadership. So CFOs, CEOs, those that are signing the paperwork, they may not have as clear an understanding. So documenting your needs is one of the essential parts, and really clearly articulating the goals and the objectives of your proposed solutions, really writing that out. And this will be at the heart of your business case that you build internally as you're seeking buy-in from stakeholders to actually implement systems like this. A lot of times, leadership have not worked on clinical studies. They might think, hey, paper's free, why don't we use that? This is where you begin to lay out, this is why we need this. Next, identifying internal stakeholders and sponsors. So even though this is the third step, you really should begin identifying stakeholders as soon as you decide to build a case for a new EDC solution. Even if, again, you're spearheading the process, you really need everyone who has a stake in the process to be involved at some point of the buying decision. And that may not be during software demos, that may be towards the end, but making a list of the key people who will need to be kept abreast of what's happening or will be actively involved in carrying out this process is really key. And then evaluating vendors. I've got a slide here following, talking through some of the key questions to have answered during the evaluation. And these are questions that I get day in, day out, and you should anticipate and expect to ask those questions to any vendor you're talking to. But then subsequent to that, building the case for the solution that you want. So once you have a specific vendor that you believe is the best fit, you'll always already be talking to their sales team. They should be able to work with you to build a business case for the solution that's taking into account your company's unique circumstances. Examples of business case building would be travel time. How is this tool going to eliminate or minimize travel time? Flights are very expensive. Hotel stays are very expensive. Can we minimize data monitoring on site and still have real-time access to data from the studies? Another aspect of building that business case would be something like reduction in the time spent on data cleaning, data management, prepping the data for analysis. EDC tools are very good at helping to clean data or helping to receive clean data as it's being entered, and this will help to minimize data cleanup efforts that take place afterwards. So laying out that reduction in the time spent on those activities, again, can build that business case. And then shorter study timelines due to the faster study setup. So setting up the EDC can be very quick. It's a lot faster than putting together binders and sending those out. And also the reduced study closure time. So just some aspects to consider for building that case. And then establish a transition plan. So you'll want to lay out the process and the timeline for implementation of the EDC, what onboarding and training looks like, what support looks like initially, as well as ongoing support. Who needs to be trained on the system? What does site training look like? And then really importantly, what validation packages are made available by the EDC provider? And then lastly, you'll create that business case and present that. So this is obviously the key step in sharing with internal stakeholders all that you found throughout this entire process. We do have a buyer's guide that we have listed here in this URL at the bottom. And this is a much more in-depth review of key considerations that you want to make. I took some of the highlights from that buyer's guide and put that in the slide here. But that buyer's guide will provide a really nice comprehensive guide of how to actually approach and purchase EDC tools. When it comes to actually speaking with the EDC and key questions to answer about those vendors, I have some of those listed here. Electronic data capture software tools, they really range widely in terms of functionality, customizability, and control of the data. And also price varies widely as well. So here are some of those key considerations. So making sure that whatever EDC solution that you're looking to use, it should be compliant out of the box to facilitate compliance with good clinical practice, electronic signatures, patient privacy, all of these things. This should really be table stakes and ensuring that that's ongoing validation that the EDC provider is doing for you is really a key piece. And then understanding this second bullet point can vary widely. Solution implementation can vary from a couple weeks up to 6 months, depending on the EDC platform that's being used. And that obviously ties in very intimately with the overall study timeline. So really understanding how quickly can this system be implemented. And then how does it facilitate data privacy? What kind of permissions and controls within the software are in place to make sure I have X, Y, and Z permissions, my clinical staff have different permissions specific to data entry, for instance. Access to the data, we mentioned when it comes to CROs, this can vary pretty widely. When it comes to EDCs, this can also vary widely. Some EDC systems are very user-friendly and sponsors are able to have direct control of the platform, of the software. And some other EDC systems are a little bit more difficult to use. Typically, a data manager at the EDC provider is scoping out and generating reports, data exports, that sort of thing. And then the calls that I'm involved with, we're typically scoping out, here's my protocol, here are my case report forms, here's the clinical setting in which the study is being executed. How is your software tool going to facilitate and make life easy for clinical site staff to actually participate in this study? So really seeing customized demonstrations of the system as might be applied to the clinical workflow that your study is considering. And then lastly, there are some generic general purpose tools out there ensuring that the EDC system that you're selecting is built specifically for MedTech companies to collect human clinical data is really of utmost importance there. On that note, I'll make a quick mention of Greenlight Guru's clinical tool. The Greenlight Guru clinical tool is an electronic data capture tool. It is the leading toolbox for MedTech clinical data collection, and it is a single compliant platform for collection, management of all clinical evidence, safety, and performance data. It works across platforms, device platforms, so very user-friendly and intuitive for especially the clinical end users. And really encourage anyone on the call here to learn more. Visit greenlight.guru/clinical to learn more about that particular system. So with that, I'll wrap. We talked about regulatory, business case for collecting clinical data, and then some of the key considerations when scoping out how to actually do the work efficiently and outsource where necessary, all while keeping an eye on timelines and budget. So I will pass it back to you here, Dwayne, at this point, and we'll keep on marching.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. For anyone who has questions, feel free to drop them in. Chris, we did have a question come up earlier, but it was you literally addressed it on the very next slide. Okay. And so it was more related to Class 2A versus Class 2B in the EU, and just kind of asking what about those. And so we already covered that. Okay. A few things that I think you touched on that, just from our experience, my personal background in a CRO, working for NAMSA and then Covance, which was LabCorp, and now Fortrea. But then our experience at Project MedTech, I wanted to highlight a couple things because I think they're really important. You talked about the exits with 510K and PMA products and the importance of clinical data, and that should be a signal to anyone who is early on in this phase, the importance of clinical data, because the reason that you see that is, when you have a 510K product, by definition, you are substantially equivalent to something else on the market, right? And so when you're going through the FDA, you're talking about how similar you are to something. And then when you get to market, you're talking about how different you are, right? And to your point about adoption of a product, clinical data is what will drive that clinical adoption. In a 510K's case, though, it's not just good enough to have clinical data. You have to have sales, right? And strategics know that. They want to see that people are purchasing your product. They want to see that you're displacing the competition on the market. And so that is why that takes so much longer. But with a PMA or a de novo, strategics look at that and say, great, if you've got that clinical data, we will put that into our sales machine that we have built, right? Because that's essentially what Medtronic and Boston Scientific and J&J and Zimmer and all these companies are really robust sales networks. They could take that clinical data and plug that right in, right? And so I love the fact that you shared that, because that is a direct indicator of how important clinical data is in your entire business plan.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I wanted to mention that. I also wanted to call out too the culture fit from you to a CRO, but also how you work with the CRO is incredibly important, right? Especially as an early stage company. If you don't treat them as part of the team and you treat them like a service provider, you will set yourself up for a poor relationship with any CRO. It doesn't matter who you're working with. And so, while you were going through that, there was just so much in those 7 slides or 7 steps that you had there that I just wanted to re-highlight those. Absolutely. One of the questions that just came in was, what type of KPI areas do the data reports from Greenlight Guru's report out? Can it be utilized in research use only?
So in terms of the KPI information that you can pull out of the system, it is pretty flexible. So there's reporting functionality built in, and I'll touch on kind of 3 ways that you can extract KPI information. So there's built-in reporting, where you can essentially look at the entire data set and then filter that data set based on what you need to see. So if you're looking at a specific primary endpoint data point, you want to see all of that in one listing, tracking that particular data point across all sites, across all subjects. You can kind of create your own reports within the data. That's a really, really powerful tool that's relatively new within the last year. We launched that reporting functionality. So that's one way that you can extract and pull that type of information out. You can also export the data at any time. So that is somewhat unique to Greenlight Guru Clinical, where sponsors can actually go in and export data any time of the day. That's one of the permissions that you control. A lot of EDCs, you have to call somebody, talk to a data manager, have a conversation about what you're looking to get out of the data, and then wait a day or two, and they'll extract that, send you something. So you can do that at any time, and that's going to kick out the raw data set, and you can really sky's the limit in terms of analyzing that output. That'll be XLS CSV format. And then lastly, we do have custom reports, custom dashboards. So sometimes you want to see a graphical representation or a tabular representation of enrollments, stuff like that, very specific metrics that you're tracking, maybe KPIs represented a certain way. We can utilize Microsoft Power BI to build custom reports, custom dashboards as well. Dwayne, I didn't miss the end of that question. There was there one additional piece there?
Yeah, can it be utilized in research use only?
So I guess to that question, I'm just to kind of speak out loud and maybe clarify. It sounds like for commercial purposes versus research purposes, Greenlight Guru Clinical can be used for. It is for research purposes, clinical research specifically, but it can be used for clinical research seeking commercialization. So for commercial purposes, but it is intended for clinical research specifically.
Okay, great.
Not sure if that answers, but that's my best crack.
Yeah, yeah. If that doesn't answer the question, feel free to write back in and we can get it clarified. Another question came in is what is the value of gathering clinical data from a series of FDA expanded access device deployments to initiate further investment report for the product support?
Yeah, so that's a really specific question to the expedited types of products. I don't have direct experience with those, but I understand that those are kind of compassionate use types of scenarios. I guess the value that I would see there would be, I'm guessing those are limited numbers of cases, limited numbers of patients. So as those cases happen, gathering data that you can about that, and over time building, evidence data to support that device could be valuable for submissions. I'm not as familiar, like I said, I'm not a regulatory expert by any means, but I think those are kind of low volume types of scenarios. But over time, building that into a body of evidence I would certainly think that would be valuable for submissions down the line.
Yeah, and they further clarified the question to say FDA expanded access device deployments to initiate further investment support. And so, I think, Chris, maybe part of this question could be around, do investors value clinical data? Is that a value inflection point? And I think the answer for that is 100% yes, right? Actually, from our experience at Project MedTech, and we just had a ton of our companies in Q1 have successful raises. I would make an argument based on our experience that clinical data and the achievement of capturing that may be more valuable than regulatory clearance when it comes to a 510K product. Regulatory clearance is certainly a big deal. So I'm not trying to discredit that, but I would make an argument that you see a bigger value inflection if you also achieved clinical data within that. So that's probably something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I'll add on top of that, Dwayne, just in terms of the manner in which the data is captured, can also be impactful to investors as well. I've seen teams that have come in and they're looking to implement a data capture tool specifically because they have an investment round coming up and they have some clinical data, but they want something that's a compliance system, something that's will stand up to regulatory scrutiny. Because it's one thing for an investor to look at data and be impressed, but will that stand up to the regulators? So I've seen teams that are looking to adopt a tool like an EDC, specifically because they have investors coming up and they want to make sure that they can demonstrate that data was captured and also in a compliant manner.
No question. And if you think a hospital system isn't going to ask for that as well, that's also important. One other question is, have you seen startups work directly with a clinical site and your MedTech toolbox without the need of a CRO?
Yes, yeah, we have, and it's very common for that scenario to play out as well. It really depends on the capacity within the sponsor to do so and the scale of the study. If we're talking single site, maybe a physician that has a relationship with the sponsor, that's probably achievable to kind of do it yourself. We do see teams that have used the CRO in years past, and they've figured out the mechanics that are required to run a study, and then they say, okay, we can do this ourselves, and then they for subsequent studies might do it all themselves. So yes, it can be done, in short.
Yeah, and Chris, to add on that, I think that this was another point I wrote down, which is I think when you compare pharma to device, you probably see like most pharma products use a CRO, if not all of them, right? But that's because there's no pharma product going to market without FDA clinical data. In the device world, most products don't require clinical data, based on the type of submissions they are. And so it certainly is probably easier to get away with not using a CRO, or at least probably the perception of that, right? Just based on the type of how much clinical data you need as a device when compared to a pharma product. So that's good to know that is possible, though, to engage that way.
And I might even suggest, still talking to CRO just to kind of, understand if there's any gaps that you might be missing, especially if it's the first time you're running a study, thinking about doing it yourself. CROs will probably help to poke holes if there are any, so it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, that's right. The one thing you brought up earlier about key opinion leaders and podium time and the different sites you use, and sometimes those folks who are maybe going to spend a lot of time on the podium aren't going to be your highest enrollers. Can you kind of talk through, like, from a clinical perspective, what are some of the big cost drivers of a clinical study? Because spoiler alert, right, for everyone, the reason I ask this is because enrollment time and the length of it is certainly going to drive your cost way up. And so what are some of the other ones in your experience that are like, boy, if you miss this, it's going to drive the cost of that clinical study up?
Yeah, enrollment might be, for me, just off the top of my head, might be the biggest one. Slow enrollment, just gaps in enrollment. You're paying to have the study running. I think if there's a lot of study amendments, that can also slow things down a bit. So kind of getting it right the first time, if at all possible, with minor changes down the road is a lot better than trying to get up and running as fast as possible, maybe with a half-baked protocol or CRFs. So amendments can change that a lot.
Well,
yeah, Dwayne, what do you think?
Yeah.
What any others for
Yeah.
you?
Enrollment comes to mind, number of people, number of sites, right? These are all things that will just drive costs way up. Enrollment is the biggest question mark, because if it doesn't happen the way you think it does, those are hidden costs, right? If you preemptively add a site, you kind of know what that cost is. If you kind of know how many people are going to be in the study. Enrollment is like that just biggest, I don't know, right?
Yeah, adding sites can be expensive too. So if you have a site that you start with and something changes, an investigator leaves or something like that, adding new sites can be pretty costly. Even like a research coordinator, Those are kind of the unsung heroes at a site. They're doing a lot of the actual project management at the clinical site. So sites that have, long tenured research coordinators or, a really robust clinical team is really the ideal. If there's kind of one person that you're hanging a lot of hope on, that can be a little bit risky, and that can lead to delays.
Yep. One person just wrote in, it's not a question, but more of a statement, is that very helpful information. They'd love a recording. And as a reminder for anyone who's listening in, you will be sent a recording for this. And if you follow Galen on LinkedIn, and then also on their YouTube channel, you'll see this recording in the next couple weeks. So with that being said, Chris, thank you for your time. Thank you for your presentation. Thanks for answering the questions. Excellent job. There's information on Galen data on the website or on the screen right now. There is a link to reach out to both Greenlight Guru and Galen data. Thanks everyone for listening in. We will have the May webinar information out here shortly. And with that, you'll see that we were very early on Christmas in July with the Christmas tree in the background. So anyways, thanks everyone and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Dwayne.